The judge said the words, "This divorce is final." I didn't look at Madison. I simply leaned toward my attorney and whispered 2 words, "Audit it." 10 minutes later, I was buckling my youngest into a seat on a plane. My 2 older kids sat in the row behind us in that heavy, stunned silence you only see in children who have watched their world be sold piece by piece. Madison thought she had won the crown jewel of our family's mountain estate. She had no idea she just signed for a pile of protected dirt she can never build on. Would you have walked away and left the legacy behind, or would you have waited for the law to do what words couldn't? Leaving wasn't a choice, it was a deployment. I watched the wheels of the aircraft tuck into the belly of the plane, a mechanical finality that matched the signature on the decree I had left in that wood-panelled room, 3,000 miles below. The relocation order had been the only part of the settlement I refused to negotiate. In exchange for the Crown Jewel Lodge, Madison had signed the papers allowing me to move the children across state lines without a second thought. She was so blinded by the acreage that she didn't realize she was trading her children's daily presence for a pile of untouchable dirt. Lily, who is 10 years old, was staring out the window with an intensity that told me she was mapping her own internal coordinates. She hadn't asked about the lodge. She hadn't asked about her mother. She was simply holding her backpack, the blue one with the worn straps, as if it were the only stable ground left in the world. Madison used to call me the sensible one. She said it with a light, airy dismissiveness, the way an investor might talk about a low-yield government bond. To her, sensible meant predictable. It meant I was the guy who would always be there to fix the structural leaks in her chaotic social narrative, while she pursued the next high-status acquisition. She thought my calm was a lack of ambition. Looking back now, I realize that for 10 years, I wasn't just building houses. I was building a cage for myself, one high-end finish at a time. I had become the silent investor in her version of family footing the bill for a subscription where I was the only one paying the cost. But true silence isn't an absence of thought. It is the presence of a plan. While she was busy measuring the silk curtains for the west wing of the lodge, I was in the early morning hours, usually around 4:30 in the morning, conducting a different kind of architecture. I had spent 6 weeks preparing this exit. There were calls made from a burner phone to coastal real estate agents, emails sent to school principals from an encrypted account she didn't know existed, and the quiet copying of title deeds that had sat in my father's old surveying office for decades. I didn't rush. Rushing is a structural flaw that leads to collapse. Instead, I worked with the precision of a restoration architect, ensuring that when the floor finally dropped out, the kids and I would already be standing on a different foundation. If I am being honest, the hardest part wasn't the logistics. It was the acting. It was sitting across from her at dinner, listening to her talk about the resort she planned to build on my grandfather's meadow and nodding as if I were in agreement with the terms. As the plane reached 30,000 feet, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A single notification appeared. It was an automated confirmation from the county recorder's office. The heritage audit, the comprehensive survey I had commissioned in secret, was now an official part of the public record. The trap was set. The land Madison thought was her multi-million-dollar prize was now legally locked into a state of permanent preservation. She was currently at the lodge, probably pouring a vintage Cabernet to celebrate her win. She had no idea she was drinking in a room that was about to become very, very expensive to maintain and impossible to sell. Leo shifted in his sleep, his head resting against the seat. I took a slow, steady breath. The air didn't taste like the mountains anymore. It tasted like salt. The lodge was my grandfather's blood and bone. I spent 3 years stripping the rot from the beams and replacing the cedar shakes, not just as an architect, but as a son who believed he was anchoring his children's identity to the earth. I poured $1,500,000 of my own liquid assets into the Heritage Development Trust. At the time, I didn't realize that while I was checking the moisture content of the floor joists, Madison was checking the market value of the timber rights. She viewed the land as a commodity to be liquidated. I viewed it as a legacy to be protected. If I'm being honest, I should have seen the cracks in the foundation much earlier. Madison didn't love the mountains. She loved the reflection of herself she saw in the name on the gate. This is what I've come to call the illusion of borrowed heritage. She suffered from a specific kind of psychological entitlement, the belief that by marrying into a history, She had somehow earned the right to destroy it for a profit. She adopted my family's status like a costume, but she lacked the structural integrity to carry the weight that came with it. To her, the lodge was just a prop for a social narrative. She was desperate to sell to people who only liked her for the rooms she could host them in. It took me years to understand that compassion was a luxury Madison had overdrafted for a long time. While I was budgeting for a future where Leo and Lily would have a place to retreat from the world, she was holding secret lunch meetings in town with developers who wore suits and carried spreadsheets. She wanted to turn my grandfather's lower meadow into a high-density resort with 42 luxury villas and a clubhouse that would have bled the local aquifer dry. She had forged my name on a preliminary power of attorney, a document I only discovered when I noticed a slight discrepancy in our title insurance renewal. I didn't confront her immediately, but I didn't stay silent either. I secretly filed a notice of invalidity with my private attorney and secured the original forged document in a safety deposit box. In my profession, if you find a load-bearing wall has been tampered with, you don't kick it down immediately. You shore up the rest of the structure first. I had been the quiet engine behind her lifestyle for too long. That afternoon, I didn't just close the account, I severed the connection. I realized that my stability was the only thing keeping her world from spinning out of control. Lily leaned over and touched the compass in my pocket, the brass one my father used when he was surveying the North Ridge. She asked a question that cut through the engine noise. Did Mom really want the lodge, or did she just want the parties? I didn't have to lie to her anymore. I looked at the dark expanse of the cabin and whispered the truth she already knew. She wanted the name, Lily. She never wanted the dirt. The descent was beginning. The first signs of coastal light were breaking through the clouds, and for the first time, I wasn't the one being left in the dark. Madison was already spending the money she hadn't legally earned. While I was dragging suitcases across a linoleum floor in a coastal rental, she was standing in the great room of the lodge, the one where I had hand-set every stone in the fireplace. I knew exactly how she looked, chin tilted up, a glass of $500 vintage in one hand, gesturing to the floor-to-ceiling windows as if the view was something she had personally commissioned. She wasn't just celebrating a divorce, she was celebrating a hostile takeover. Later I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she had invited a team of developers from Denver to the property that very afternoon. She was playing the role of the visionary mogul, wearing a designer mountain chic ensemble that cost more than my first truck. She walked them through the lower meadow, describing where the 42 villas would sit and where the paved roads would cut through the ancient pine groves. She had convinced them that the Heritage Development Trust was her exclusive vehicle, a clean asset ready for immediate liquidation. By 4:45 p.m., she had signed an exclusive option contract. She accepted a $500,000 non-refundable deposit, or at least she believed it was non-refundable. To Madison, this was the ultimate validation. She had outmaneuvered the sensible architect. She had taken the legacy and converted it into liquid capital before the ink on the divorce decree was even dry. She reportedly told the lead developer that I was settling into a shabby little life by the ocean, claiming I had lost my nerve for the high-stakes world of mountain real estate. It is a common human pattern. When someone values optics over integrity, they assume everyone else is as shallow as they are. She was so busy projecting her own arrogance onto my exit that she failed to ask why I had surrendered so easily. If I'm being honest, I almost felt a flicker of pity for the developers. They were professional predators, but even they weren't prepared for the level of radioactive title work Madison was handing them. That is the danger of narcissistic mirroring. She had adopted the prestige of my name for so long that she believed she possessed the expertise that came with it. Some people are so busy measuring the curtains that they forget to check the foundation. She saw the lodge as a social trophy, a gilded cage she could sell to the highest bidder. She never bothered to look at the zoning maps or the federal preservation audits. She assumed that because she held the paper, she held the power. As I sat on the small back patio of our new home, listening to the rhythmic pulse of the Pacific, I looked at the copies of the contracts Madison had been shopping around for months. She had signed a binding agreement to deliver buildable land. At 5:31 p.m., she sent me a text that simply said, "I hope you enjoy the view of the tide. I'll be sending you photos of the groundbreaking next month." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. I knew that within 48 hours, the developer's legal team would conduct their own title search. They were about to discover that the mogul they just gave $500,000 to was holding a deed to a federal sanctuary where you can't even sink a fence post without a court order. Truth has a way of sinking deep foundations. My father, Frank, arrived at the coastal house 3 days after we landed, carrying a heavy leather tube that smelled of old parchment and wood smoke. He is a man who spent 40 years measuring the exact distance between certainty and speculation. He sat at my new kitchen table, pushing aside a bowl of sliced fruit, and unrolled the topographical survey of the mountain estate. "She really signed it?" he asked, his voice a low gravel of professional curiosity. "She signed it," I replied, watching him adjust his spectacles. He pointed a calloused finger to the lower meadow, the area Madison was currently marketing as the Golden Valley development. "Then she's inherited a grave, Brandon." At the time, I didn't realize how much weight a single line on a map could carry. Looking back now, I see that my father's lessons were never just about land. They were about the architecture of accountability. He taught me that you cannot build a life on a swamp, no matter how much you pay for the marble floors. Madison had spent 3 years hiring high-end interior designers to dream up floor plans for a location that was, legally speaking, a ghost. Frank unrolled the second map, the heritage audit I had commissioned while Madison was busy networking at the country club. It was a federal overlay that didn't exist in the county's digital database yet. The entire meadow was designated as a conservation offset for a local endangered owl species. Under federal law, the acreage was untouchable. Any attempt to clear cut or grade that land triggered a restoration bond that would cost more than the property was worth. "She took a deposit, Dad," I said, leaning against the counter. $500,000. Frank let out a dry, clinical laugh. "Then she's in a legal race against the clock. The moment that developers' attorneys pull this federal overlay, they won't just want their money back. They'll want damages for breach of contract and misrepresentation. This wasn't an act of revenge. It was simply the reconciliation of an account." I had known about the conservation status for 6 months. I had formally documented my concerns in 3 separate emails during the mediation phase, urging her to perform a specialized environmental audit. She had replied through her counsel, calling my warnings obstructionist tactics designed to lower the property's value. I didn't hide the truth. I simply stopped shouting it at someone who had paid a high-priced lawyer to keep her ears closed. So I stopped being the warning system. I became the audit. I watched the clock on the wall, 10:11 a.m. The county office had been open for an hour. The title report would be landing in the developer's inbox at any moment. My phone on the table buzzed, vibrating with a frantic energy that filled the quiet room. A text message appeared on the screen from a number I hadn't blocked yet. "What did you do to the title? The buyers are pulling out." Consequences are rarely loud. They are usually documented. I sat on my small coastal porch, the scent of brine and damp cedar filling the air, and let Madison's frantic text sit unanswered for a long time. 10 minutes later, my attorney Robert called with the update. The Denver Development Group hadn't just pulled out, they had filed a lis pendens on the entire mountain estate to recoup their $500,000 deposit. They were alleging fraudulent inducement. Looking back now, I see the beautiful irony of her greed. During the final months of our marriage, Madison had worked tirelessly to have the Heritage Development Trust redefined as her separate property. She wanted the prestigious name, but she wanted it disconnected from my oversight. She had even signed an affidavit stating she had exclusive knowledge and control of the land's future. It was a move designed to cut me out of the profit. Instead, it welded her to the liability. Because she had claimed sole responsibility for the trust management, the federal government didn't look for me when the conservation violations were flagged. They looked for the person whose signature was on the intent to develop forms she had filed weeks before the divorce. The double trigger I had anticipated finally hit. The federal restoration bond was triggered a $1,500,000 penalty for the unauthorized clearing and soil testing her developers had already begun in the lower meadow. At the time, I didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. I simply felt the quiet satisfaction of a structure finally becoming plumb. It took me years to understand that some people are so busy measuring the height of their pedestal that they never bother to check if the ground beneath it is shifting. That's when I realized that fairness doesn't always require a shout. Sometimes it just requires an accurate audit. Madison had overdrafted her social account for years, borrowing prestige she couldn't pay back. Now, the institutional bank was calling in the debt. By 2:15 p.m., the local mountain papers were already picking up the story of the lodge preservation crisis. The social circle Madison had cultivated, the same people who had smiled at her while she mocked my shabby exit, were now distancing themselves. In their world, a scandal involving federal fines and lawsuits is a contagion. They don't offer sympathy to those who have lost their utility. They offer silence. My phone rang again. This time it wasn't a text. It was the lead counsel for the Denver developers. They weren't looking for a fight with me. They were looking for the surveyor's truth. I let the phone vibrate against the salt-worn railing until the battery finally surrendered. Madison had called 10 times in 3 hours, a frantic, high-frequency signal that used to send me into an immediate defensive posture. Now, it was just background noise, as irrelevant as the static on a dead radio station. I didn't answer. I didn't listen to the voicemails. If I'm being honest, I already knew the script. She would alternate between blaming me for the title glitch and demanding I use my reputation to bail her out of the developer's lawsuit. She needed my reaction to fuel her own sense of reality. By denying her that reaction, I was finally reclaiming my own sovereignty. Looking back now, I realize that detachment is the ultimate form of power over a manipulator. For a decade, I had been the structural support for a woman who treated my loyalty like an unlimited line of credit. The moment I stopped cooperating, the entire illusion of her power began to liquefy. This was the silent withdrawal, a strategic retreat, not out of cowardice, but out of the realization that some battles are won simply by refusing to stand in the line of fire. I wasn't just leaving a house, I was leaving a dynamic where I was expected to provide the logic for her chaos. It took me years to understand that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop volunteering to carry the weight. I stood on the shore, watching Leo and Noah chase the receding tide. Lily was a few yards away, her camera, the one I'd given her for her birthday, aimed at the horizon. The sound of the Pacific was a steady, low-altitude pulse, a heavy contrast to the thin, frantic air of the mountain peaks we'd left behind. Up there, every conversation felt like it was happening at the edge of a cliff. Down here, there was only the gravity of what was real. I had conceded the stone and the cedar, but I had saved the only part of the legacy that actually breathed. The legacy wasn't in the title deed Madison was currently choking on. It was in the way Noah laughed without looking over his shoulder for a coming storm. It was in the way Lily sat on the sand, no longer acting as the emotional shield for her younger brothers. I had liquidated my liquid assets to buy this piece, and it was the best trade I ever made. My father's surveyor tube stayed in the hallway of our rental, a reminder that the most important thing you can measure is the distance between who you were and who you've decided to be. I finally plugged my phone into the charger. As the screen flickered to life, a notification from an old mountain community group caught my eye. It was a post from a local realtor I'd known for years. The Heritage Lodge is heading to a forced judicial sale at the end of the month. The legal liens have finally stripped the title bare. A tragic end to a local landmark. I set the phone face down and walked toward my children. 6 months later, I finally stopped checking the mountain listings. The Heritage Lodge was auctioned off on a Tuesday morning, not to a developer, but to a state park conservancy for a fraction of its original appraisal. Madison couldn't cover the $1,500,000 restoration bond, and the developers had already secured a massive judgment lien against the title. Between the federal penalties and the breach of contract lawsuit, the lodge was forced into a judicial sale faster than any tax auction ever could. The property I had painstakingly restored was now public land protected by the very zoning laws she had tried to ignore. If I'm being honest, I felt a twinge of sadness as I read the final sale notice. It was the place where I thought my children would learn the history of our name. But looking back now, I realized that the lodge was never the legacy. It was just a building, a high-end finish on a life that was fundamentally hollow. You can't restore a marriage the way you restore an oak beam. Once the rot reaches the core, the only choice is to let it go. I have started a new architectural firm here on the coast. We specialize in integrity-first restoration buildings that aren't meant to be social trophies, but homes that are built to last. My office is small, the rent is reasonable, and I'm finally building a reputation that isn't tied to a name on a gate. Leo has joined a local basketball league. Lily is the lead photographer for her school paper. And Noah simply enjoys the fact that he doesn't have to listen for the sound of an argument through the bedroom door. It took me years to understand that success isn't the name on the gate, it's the peace inside the house. I had spent over a decade funding an illusion. I only understood the true value of my own worth when I stopped pouring it into a foundation that was designed to crumble. We spend so much time trying to belong to families or institutions that don't value our structural integrity. We make ourselves smaller, hoping to fit into their blueprint, until we eventually realize that we are the ones holding up a roof that was never meant to protect us. This story isn't just about a house or a divorce. It's for those who have ever felt like the outsider in their own family, the ones who provided the stability while everyone else took the credit. If you are standing where I once stood, staring at a foundation that is clearly compromised, remember this: the most important audit you will ever conduct is the one of your own worth. You don't have to win every argument to win your life. Sometimes the quietest decisions, the ones made in the early hours before the world wakes up, are the ones that change everything. I didn't destroy the heritage. I just made sure that the parts of it that were honest were the only parts that survived. My children are growing up on solid ground, and for the first time in 34 years, so am I. Have you ever had to walk away from something you loved just to save yourself? What would you have done if you were in my place? I'd really like to hear your perspective.